And here we go, guys. All right, welcome back. We are INFR3335U. That's Social and Multiplayer Game Design in the fall 2021 semester at Ontario Tech University. And it's week 6, this should say part two of our broadcast, which is all around mobile game design fundamentals. We just had our guest lecturer finish, Marc Samuel LeBlanc, which is someone I've been working with for many years, play testing. And he brought his unique perspective, from a playtesting perspective to our world, right? So it's, how he did things, what he found was important, and what he found was frustrating. And he gave some examples of some things that you could do to make your games better through playtesting. Let's move into the next piece of what we're going to be talking about, which is kind of an intro to games user research. So playtesting, this idea of playtesting didn't arise from nowhere. I mean, back in the day, it was, hey, I want to play your game and see if it's going to work okay. If it's exactly what the thing that you designed is working the way you want it to. But games user research kind of grew out of, the idea that we need to analyze games in a lot more detail in order for us to get more, I would say, empirical evidence about what is working well and what does not work well with games. And maybe there's something that works across all games, whether mobile or on a console or PC, as an example, that we can take away. Some things that we can take away. Some, we'll call them, aspects of game development that we want to focus in on. Things that we've learned from in the game, from playing games in over the last 40 years, let's just say. So what are those things? Are they common to some other games? And games user research is there. So really what it's about is it's really a core part of game development now, right? So now one thing I have to put my hand up, and there's a bit of a disclaimer here, that this course is not a games user research course. So the few slides that I put together here for you for tonight are not the sum of all things that you need to know for games user research. Next semester, like I said, in the winter of 2022, you're going to be taking a full-blown course on games user research. And one of the outcomes from that is for you to actually play test your third year GDW game multiple times. We'll talk about that in a bit. And that's one of the outputs, if you will, of the course, to actually go through the playtesting process yourself and see, and get some really good, solid feedback from other users, people that are other players, people that are playing your game in a very, I would say, scientific and academic manner. Okay, so one of the reasons why we do any kind of games user research, and by the way, games user research is done at all points of game development now, is really understanding players. That's where the main focus of it. Why are players playing the way they're playing? And what is play testing from a digital perspective? And really what we have to think about is exactly what it says here, which is games live and die commercially on the player experience. So if the player experience is bad, then the game's going to die. It's going to, no one's going to come to the party, so to speak. So really, it's a way we optimize the quality of our user experience, UX, in games, working all aspects of the game, including mechanics, the UI, aesthetics, interactions, the progression through the game. And of course, the main thing, what we want to be able to do is it fun? Sure, it's functional, but we want to get to that fun in the game. And that's something that we want to know. We want to also know that fun that we're getting in the game matches the design, the vision of the designer. We might get fun in the game accidentally. It's not exactly what the designer planned. And that's okay. That's kind of a fun or a happy accident, sometimes is what we call it. But the idea here is we want to be able to find the fun in the game academically. We want to be able to find the fun in the game, in a way that we're being analytical, right? Not just random. Okay, it's not a random experience. And Marc was talking about earlier how we did a lot of trial and error. And trial and error has a nice funny word to it, which is a heuristic. It's an algorithm that we're going to be using and kind of a few criteria that we're going to be looking at in order for us to know that things are going exactly as the designer planned. Okay, so that is kind of a very high level view. We're talking about 50,000 feet of what games user research is. Again, think about games user research coming into different times, in the development process. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about playtesting. Mark just talked about playtesting. Let's continue with that. It's the most well-known practice, and really, what we want to do in games, we're talking about in video games, is you're being observed. When you're a playtester in a AAA studio, you're probably in some kind of kind of fishbowl, if you will, where people are able to observe you. They might have cameras on you. You might include other things, other methods that we can observe players. And what we're looking for is we want to take detailed notes on the player's behavior. Things like, as an example, how the player is reacting. What is their emotional state? Are they do we feel that they're in a state of flow, similar to what Mark was talking about in his presentation? And we also want to be able to follow up and get qualitative data from the player when it comes to how did you feel? How did you think the game went? What do you think could be changed and improved? All those kind of things. Jonathan says it's monitored state. And one of the things I always found when I'm play testing something more formally is when I'm being observed, it's not my natural state. Okay, if I'm being observed in a tournament, or if I'm being observed doing something else, it's not my natural state, right? It's different when I'm actually playing the game on my own, solo, than when I'm being watched. Okay, and so that's a different thing. And games user researchers know about this phenomenon, and it's called the observer effect, right? So the observer effect is that when you're being watched, right, you're actually changing things because the person who's playing and being watched knows they're being watched, so they're going to behave differently. And yes, it happens in the beginning, but as the play continues and as the player gets immersed into the gameplay, that level of being observed, that feeling of being observed or being watched goes away, all right, if the game is good. If it's not good, well then, it doesn't matter. So again, it's one of the ways to understand players, but we can use other things other than playtesting. For example, sometimes it's not just observational things that we use. We might use things like analytics, tracking things like heat maps, using heat maps to understand where the player's going and why they're choosing the things that they're choosing. We might use engagement diaries where you actually keep, you play the game for a long time, as an example, and you keep a diary of things that you diarize every time you play, and your feelings, your thoughts around the play over a long period of time, as opposed to a very short session. Short sessions are okay, but longer engaged play for a longer period of time and getting information back from that is by far more meaningful. Biometrics is another method we use to get physiological data on how the player is feeling and how they're responding, their heart rate, their body heat, muscle movements. For example, we can get things like their EMG, which is your muscular, kind of if you can attach sensors to your arms and to different parts of your body to get a sense of when your body's tightening and releasing and so on. There's a lot of things you can do. Eye tracking, of course, is also other things we can use, and other methods other than just observing play. Yes, absolutely. So Jonathan says we talked about this in organizational behavior. Yes, being observed, it changes the way you behave. It does change the way you behave, and again, it really depends on how you're being observed, right? So if you're being observed or you're being appraised, and you're getting, people love to know how they're doing, progression, right? Which is what we're going to talk about. But if you're being observed and you're being, under a kind of a critical eye, as an example, sometimes that can have a negative effect. All right. And Jonathan says you wouldn't monitor physical state if you care more on emotions. Sometimes, facial recognition, biometrics again, can be used to kind of understand emotions. We can actually use machine learning, and the eyes. The eyes can tell us a lot, and the mouth can tell us a lot about what the emotion the player is feeling. All right, so that's something we can look at. One thing I also have here is standard testing that we used to use back in the day was like we run every participant through a series of tests, and then we just make changes based on their feedback. But there is something that you're going to learn about next semester called write testing, which allows you to do rapid iterations, where you do multiple iterations, testing multiple times across your game, and making changes quickly, right? So quick, kind of changes based on things that you've learned from one iteration to the other. So you don't wait for everybody to finish playtesting your game before you make those changes. So you come up with a patch or a build based on the feedback that you're getting, the fun that the other players have found. One thing that we have a challenge with when it comes to making our own games is, we think the game is fun, but we know the game. We've made a game. When we give that game to somebody else, they don't know how to play your game. They're going to give you more solid feedback, if you will, or honest, transparent feedback a lot of times, especially with a questionnaire that's going to say, yes, this was good, and this wasn't so good. Okay. Jonathan says, for horror games, knowing when people are tensing and when they are looking helps elevate the game experience and think more about their player base. Absolutely. We want them to be afraid, right? That's what the horror game is all about, right? We want them to be tense. We want them to have conflict. We want them to feel frustrated sometimes or elated, right? Happy that things are happening the way they want. Let's think about a little bit about heuristic evaluation. So this idea of the heuristic word that Mark was talking about, he talked about it as trial and error. And what heuristic evaluations do is they identify any kind of problems associated with design of user interfaces, but also design of the game experience. Okay, so there was these two consultants. This guy, Jacob Nielsen, is still alive. He's still very much active. Right, Rolf Molik and Jacob Nielsen, they developed a system. They were working as usability engineers, and Jacob Nielsen created his heuristic evaluation system, and they're right now being used. All the heuristics that he's created, almost like think about them as categories or as criteria for games. And not just for games, but for interfaces, are still being used as a de facto standard in the user interface and user experience aspect of the industry. And we're talking about all user interfaces. You might learn about Nielsen's heuristics if you're doing web design or if you're doing app design, outside of mobile application development. You might hear about their heuristics, and you're going to hear more about Nielsen's heuristics next semester during games user research, and even more about them during HCI, which is in 4th year, if I'm not wrong, for you guys. So that's something that you're going to be learning more about. But his heuristics, just to summarize what they are visibility of system status, right? So in other words, getting feedback on the type of system, a match between the system and the real world, which is bringing in affordances, things that we know from the real world into the game world, right? User control of freedom, that speaks to agency again. We've been talking about agency, not just for this talk that Mark did, but even the previous talk that Daryl did, and the one before that when Rui was talking about narrative design. We've been hearing the same thing over and over again, that user control and agency, freedom, if you will, is something that we want across all games. So if your game doesn't give the user freedom or agency, even if it's perceived, it's maybe something that you need to work on. Consistency and standards. We want to be able to give the user the same kind of consistent interface they're used to. Don't create new things out of the blue. As an example, if you have a standard controller interface, use that, right? And if you're going to introduce a new one, there's got to be really great reasons for doing that. Error prevention. Let the user know when they're doing something wrong and correct them early. Let them fail early, but correct them and get them on the right path if they're going to play your game properly. Recognition rather than recall. User interface, when you look at it, we're going to talk about magic interfaces later on in this talk. it should be something that you can understand. And again, an affordance from the real world. If I have a symbol in the real world that works, that I understand, bring that symbol into the game world so that users can instantly understand what that is. Flexibility and efficiency of use. I should have flexibility. If I want to skip an instruction screen, then I should be allowed to do that. And aesthetic and minimalist design. Don't let the user interface get in my way, which is what we've talked about before. So those are the 10 heuristics. There's some great videos. If you actually go to the link here that I've shared with you, there's some great videos on what that is. And again, you'll learn all about this next semester, so I don't want to spend too much more time on this. They've also come across with some great heuristics applied to video games. And I've given you the link for this. And the reason for this is because you're in the process in GDW right now in this first semester of third year, and you're developing your game. Think about some of the things that you can read here, and when they start thinking about talking about how these heuristics should work in a good game. When you violate these heuristics, when the heuristic is violated, and it's going to happen sometimes because it doesn't work every single time, right? How can you, is it violated for a good reason? Right, that kind of thing. So that's what visibility of system status and all the other heuristics are there for. Please read through the article. I think it's a great read. Again, this is tied into the in-class exercise I gave you, which is, and I'll go there right now. Let's go there online. So one of the things I asked you guys to do in the latest in-class exercise, let's go there. ICE3, again, do this Friday, a short, very short. It doesn't have to be 500 words, guys. I say 250 to 500 just to give you a range. It could be a short little paragraph or some bullet points in your thoughts, add some screenshots. But really what I want you to do is think about the importance of the player experience with respect to interface design. Okay, what is that? And think about a game that really good, uses good UI, UX, things that have been tested. We're talking about play testing today, tested really well. And this could be a mobile game or another game that you enjoy playing. And using some of these usability heuristics, or like Mark was talking about, trial and error kind of metrics, if you will, applied to games. How does the user interface that your game, how does it kind of enhance the player's experience? Because really, everything we make, whether it's a character sheet, or whether it's something that, like for a tabletop game, or whether it's something that we're seeing in the game world, it should really enhance the player's experience. If it doesn't, why is it there? Right? That's something you should think about. And I want you also to think about a rating system. It's a very simple rating system, maybe a 3-point rating system. And when I mean 3 points, like 3 components or 3 criteria, if you will. The 3 most important things, maybe up to 5, that you find is super important when it comes to user interface design and the user interface itself. You can use it a 5-point Likert scale, like for example, strongly disagree to strongly agree, something like that. Across these different components you selected, and rate the game. Actually rate the game and tell me how do you feel? How do you feel the game is across your criteria when it comes to user interface? You don't have to use Nielsen's heuristics, but you can kind of add to them. You can add other things that are important that you think that haven't been covered here. Okay. Again, 250 to 500 words max. You can use images. To enhance your argument, all that kind of stuff. Again, this is something similar to what we're going to be talking about in the final exam. I'm going to be talking about user experience design. Those things are going to be on the written component of your final exam. So that's why this is practice for you, and it's worth marks. I'm paying you for it. All right, let's get back to this then. So let's also talk about play heuristics for evaluating games. And I put this little document on Canvas. Again, you're going to be working with this much more extensively in your games user research course. So again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I think it's a really great document to look at while you're developing your game. This is the perfect time for you to do this right now as an example. And let me just make sure why is this not published? I think it's a really great, kind of example of, what you can use to kind of carry on. So let's take a look at play heuristics. So if you look at play heuristics as an example, they ask a few questions. Some of the things that Mark actually covered, which is, enduring play, challenge, strategy and pace, and consistency in the game world, and goals. So there's a couple of questions here, and there's different categories, and not all heuristics that are defined here in this area and this document should apply to every single game that is being made today. For example, maybe your game doesn't include humor, so that the heuristic for humor doesn't apply to you. And we're going to talk about, again, that next semester. But I want you to think about this. I think it's fun to think about these things while you're designing and developing your game for GDW. So example, things like ask yourself some of these questions. The player finds the game fun with no repetitive or boring tasks. Mark talked about that actually in his presentation. What he said was, it shouldn't be repetitive. He doesn't like the fact that when I was playing Valheim, and we had to continuously kind of like mine for resources, whether it's cutting down a tree or breaking up rocks, whatever. That's a boring task for him. And that violated this particular heuristic for him, right? So think about those things for you as well and how that works. All right, so let's move on from this. So this is, I wanted to show this document to you, but I'm not going to go into details about what this is. Take a read. I think this is a great little document that is something that is going to be covered again next semester, but I think it's a great opportunity for you to use some of these questions to question your own game design and think for yourself, hey, does this apply to me? Is there something that I could, from a design perspective, use to improve my game? Okay. If I was going to improve my game design document, things that I'm missing here, for example, something that the way I'm going to design my game, these are some questions you should always be thinking about. All right, so let's continue with this one now. So that is this piece. Any questions so far about heuristics, what they mean, and what usability is all about, how a game functions, and it's all around the player, is what in your mind is what it should be. Like, what's the player experience? And how does the user interface really interact or enhance the player's experience? Okay, because we're talking about mobile fundamentals, right? And especially on a mobile device, the player's experience is going to bring that player back. It's going to increase replayability, like we've talked about in other courses, like the courses that James runs. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is user experience design specifically for mobile games. So what is user experience design? And you're going to see, maybe you've seen it already in other courses, this idea of what user experience design is. Really, it's a process where we want to zero in on, branding, design, again, back that usability and function, right? It's asking those three questions: the why, the what, and the how. Why? What are the motivations? Why are we making this thing? Why is the user interface being created this way? What is the functionality, and how is this going to work? How is it going to look from an aesthetics perspective, as an example? So that's user experience design. And really, when we think about UX design, it's a user-centered journey, right? So it's all around the user. In this case, for us, it's the player. And we also have to include things like, can we make this more inclusive nowadays? Can we improve accessibility for people that have, that want to be able to play in different ways? And we have to also think about user-centered design as an iterative process. And again, you may have seen a chart like this in other courses, where when we think about this, we want to understand the context. What is the context? What is the narrative? The narrative for you should be the context for how you're designing your user interface, right? And that's kind of leading in from what we talked about in the narrative design talk that we did, I think it was week 2, right? So, that's the context. Everything should be contextual. Actually, we've talked about this over and over again, right? And then think about the user requirements. What are those user requirements? The player requirements. What does the player need from a user interface perspective? And then start thinking about some design solutions. What are they looking like take it back to the players and to the designer and get some feedback. Is it exactly what the designer thought about? Yes, great. If it's not, go back. And that's why it's iterative. You keep on going back over and over again. You get information from the player. One of the things that I've always heard about from UX design, and one of the common statements is, get out of the building. That's the thing that we always get taught when or told when it comes to UX design, right? Or user-centered design, which is get outside the building, get to your actual end user, get them to test it. Don't just stay in your garage where you're designing your game or wherever you're doing it. Get out to people and get feedback as soon as possible, as fast as possible, so you can iterate on your user interface, you can iterate on your mechanics, on your aesthetics, and get it right. Okay, so that's something. It doesn't matter what product you're developing, whether it's a mobile game or whether it's a PC game or console game, you need to get feedback as soon as possible. And one of the things we do is when we start off our UX design, we start with wireframing. And I've asked you guys to do wireframes for your game design document, and you should know about wireframes by now, so that the technical artists in your team should be able to kind of put together wireframes that really describe in your mind what the level is going to look like that you're building. Even if it's a game that you're building, like let's say the game that Dr. Hogue has asked you to put together, which is very different than what we had when I was in third year, right, at Ontario Tech. Think about wireframing. What does the wireframe look like? And when it comes to wireframing, what we want to think about is low fidelity monochrome screens that describe your game. So if I'm going to start thinking about design for a game, I want them to be as very simple as possible. They should speak to me. I should be able to see the wireframe and go, okay, I understand where things are laid out. But this should be something that you're developing before you write one single piece of code or before you put any kind of layout in Unity or on Unreal or whatever game engine you're using, even if it's your own homegrown game engine. It should be something that you're starting to think about way ahead of time. What is that user interface going to look like, right? So start off with low fidelity monochrome screens, then move into color, right? Start thinking about some different color schemes. Think about warm colors or cool colors. And it might be something that is matching with the concept of the game, and try to include as many of those screens, including, of course, the gameplay screen, as possible, so that you can get closer to the final product of what it's going to look like. And for example, this could be a final product where you have a kind of a darker mode kind of game where the game has this racing game, as an example, has chosen darker colors and kind of a darker interface. Okay, as an example, this might be the final outcome of your wireframes. But again, you started with monochrome, and it took you right down into that kind of a colored version. One thing that we talk about when it comes to the game, and I'm going to talk about something called the magic interface. And the magic interface is I'm not going to say it's a de facto standard or anything like that, but it's in research, people have thought about ways of making interface design easier. Okay, so again, what we've discussed before is every game is a world, if we think about it. And really the purpose of our interface is to enable the player to step through that magical doorway that they can enter for a short time, right? And really an adequate interface, just an adequate interface, is one that enables the player to move around the world in some kind of efficient manner, right? That's really the adequate one. But a great interface, and I'm talking about an awesome one, considers the whole experience, including the narrative. Okay, so we've talked about that over and over again, like I said, and this is just something that adds on to it. So what we really want to talk about, this part of the lesson really talks about, how do we create these user interface that kind of tie into our mechanics. And sometimes what happens is when we are exploring interface, we also come up with some unforeseen complexity as we're making our interface, right? Things that we didn't think that we were going to need. Even going back to what Mark was saying earlier, making that character sheet, was difficult. It was difficult to really communicate what was, what we wanted from the game, right? We're making, we made Conan. We used Robert E. Howard's dream of Hyperborea, a crazy dark world, where it was savage, I would say a savage world. And we wanted to bring it to life, right? And we wanted a character sheet to reflect a bunch of things, the game world, but we also wanted to also reflect, the mechanics that we wanted to put in play that were very central to the experience of our players. All right, so that's the kind of stuff that we wanted to do. And mechanics, again, should reflect narrative, and the UI should connect to the mechanic. So it's kind of cyclical in that way and iterative. So really what we want to think about is we want to create enough fun for the player to come back. And we've talked about this before, this replayability idea. Each interaction should be genuinely fun. Okay, so something that we want to be able to do, everything that we do, the way the game sounds, the way the game feels when it's being played, all the visual effects, screen shake, basic things, from Juice It or Lose It, the video that maybe most of you saw in first year, all those kind of things. And we want to be able to persuade our player to return over and over again, especially in a mobile game, right? And Mark talked about this idea of challenge versus skill, that chart that he put together, that really is, as we become more skillful, right? We also want to become more challenged. So almost like easy to learn, harder to master, that kind of game, that progression that we want to establish in our game is something that's going to continue to add replayability. So again, when we think about challenge, and Mark talked about this as well in his talk, which was make me afraid, right? Make me afraid when I'm being challenged. I don't want to, and Daryl talked about that too in his talk, a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, when he said, you know what, I want the players to be challenged, and don't be afraid to make them afraid, I think is kind of what he said. And the reason for this is because if you make the players afraid that something's going to happen, right? That fear, conflict, some people call it fear threat reaction or whatever, is something that's going to really bring out the player, right? Whether it's on a tabletop game or in a digital version, right? So make the players afraid, give them super challenges, and but again, build up their capability in order for them to be able to compete and be challenged. Okay, so don't just throw something at them that is going to kill them, unless that's the kind of game you're going to make, Dark Souls, right? All right, so there's different ways we can challenge players: interactions, tactics, strategies, complexity, and physical skills. It can be a physical type game. But at the end of the day, what we want to do for the user interface is think about ways of connecting it to challenge. Okay, for each platformers. So this guy, Arthur C. Clarke, and many of you, may have heard of him. Actually, if I'm not wrong, Arthur C. Clarke, let's take a look at him just for a second. So he was a famous science fiction writer. As an example, he died in 2008, and he wrote some amazing short stories and all that kind of stuff. And he was one of my favorite, I would say, kind of science fiction authors back in the day. So let's take a look at some of his notable works, right? As an example, he wrote some amazing stories. Some of them, a couple of them that I know, I remember seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was a Stanley Kubrick kind of representation of Arthur C. Clarke's kind of vision, of the future. It was so interesting. And one of the things that he wrote, which is something that we've kind of restated here, is any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I love that saying. And I think that's one of the things that we think about when it comes to user interfaces. User interfaces are really like the magic of the world. Sometimes, especially if they're diegetic, they can really give of the player a sense of what's happening, right? Again, going back to Nielsen's, system status heuristic. And a great interface hides the complexity and makes it easy for us to do what we want to do, to give us that agency that we're looking for. And one of them is, the interface doesn't even exist. And in fact, if anything else, the interfaces we're talking about come in many different forms. So here, this system that's being written about, maybe you've seen it. You guys seen the system before? The Magic game interfaces? Yes, no? Maybe you've seen it. It's really a mnemonic. That's what it is. And it really goes to these 5 statements: memories, attention, goals, intuitions, and control. And again, we've seen control. We've talked about control. So memories make a lasting impression on the player. Attention, command, and provide attention. Remember we talked about attention? That's like super important, for the interface to command attention. It's super important. Goals, communicate and facilitate in the creation of plans and objectives. Intuitions, react in a way the players expect. And then control, give the players a sense that their actions have an impact or that they have agency. All right, so that's the Magic interface. And there's some great thoughts here in the Magic interface. So one of the things they talk about here is, memories, are strengthened when they're connected to an emotional experience. Okay, Mark talked about that. There was an emotional experience playing for years in the Conan world. A lot of the stuff that he did with his character Camus, he wrote stories about it. And we do that too. We play games. Stories are made from games. Movies are made from games. There's an emotional connection to some of the most successful games out there. And games use, we've talked about before, mythical symbols, visual imagery, all kinds of stuff, right? And what we want to do, we want to encourage exploration of the game world through our interface. That's what we want to be able to do. And that's kind of a very important aspect of user interface design. So another thing is we want to make it, kind of easy for us to remember how to use the interface through repetition and consistency. So if I have a button, as an example, that works in a particular way on one part of my interface, it should work and sound the exact same way in another part of my interface. So consistency is the key. It's almost like a style. The interface has its own style in terms of the way it feels and sounds and reacts and everything else. Okay. So ask these questions when it comes to if there's ways you can make your interface more memorable. Do my tutorials and explorations promote exploration and experimentation within the interface, or are they blocking it? Right? Can I introduce new parts of the interface at periods of emotional engagement? Which again, when it comes to tutorialization, what you want to try and do is introduce things to players when they need to have them introduced. Again, this goes back to our play heuristics or to Nielsen's heuristics. How can I heighten the emotional connection to interface components by using powerful, stimulating imagery? All right, that connects to the narrative, right? That's the idea, right? And how do I reward the player for learning parts of the interface? Only, give them one thing to learn at a time and then reward them when they do things the right way. And how can I reduce text and replace it with visual content? We've seen this stuff before when it comes to creating a great interface. All right, so that's really memories. Attention is, I want to be able to command attention. I want to say, hey, look over here to the player. But also what I want there to be is the player should give the player attention, show things to the player, and also focus the player's attention so that way it doesn't take away from the gameplay, right? Which is, pretty important. So one of the things that we want to also make it for those technical artists out there is, make your user interface look good. All right. I mean, making a game look very basic, it takes away from me wanting to use the interface in the first place. So when it's aesthetically pleasing and when it sounds great, sound engineers out there, when you connect with your technical artists, make sure that every interaction with that interface sounds and looks awesome, and especially for mobile. Okay, it's important for console, but for mobile, it could be the thing that makes the player never want to come back and play your game if it's a clunky interface or if it looks ugly. All right. And again, one thing we also appreciate is novelty. If it's something new, but we want to not take away from the recognition aspect of what the interface is about, right? So we want them to appear new, but yet be something that we can recognize. All right, so maybe a stylized interface that we understand what it does, right? So again, when it comes to capturing and delivering attention through your interface, ask these questions. What do I do in the game to make the player feel like the center of attention? What do I do? Remember, one of the things we talked about over the last couple of lectures is they should have an impact on the game world, right? How can I use beauty in my interface or aesthetic, right, to grab the player's attention? And what do I do that is new and differentiated compared to every other interfaces that's out there that we've seen? Okay, so again, interface design. Goals. I mean, goals kind of link really to, that's the G in Magic, to our the stuff that we've talked about before, a quest system. And there should be different kinds of goals that we've talked about before, and the interface should tie into that. So things like, and this is again reinforcing the talk we've already had on interface design, which is we should have some immediate goals. Hey, I want to get the hell away from this goblin. Or longer term goals. I want to reach level 85 so that I can kick the crap out of these goblins, right? Immediate goals are visceral. There's something that we want to get to right away that's going to get us to the next level, that's going to keep us playing. Longer term goals are, something that can tie into our quest system, and the interface has got to be able to communicate that stuff to us. So guys, when you're working with, your game engine course right now, one of the things that you're probably going to be asked to do is, sorry, Aiden, I'm going to go back to that in a second, is creating a system. Maybe it's a quest system that you're going to be creating. Just as an aside, Aiden's asking, because I don't want to lose this because there's going to be other questions. The in-class exercise says, create a simple rating system of your own 3 to 5 components. Are these 3 to 5 components the heuristics that we choose to talk about? Yes. That's exactly what you want to do. Choose to talk about those 3 to 5 criteria or heuristics that make sense to you, the most important things to you for your in-class exercise, for your particular game that you've chosen, whatever that game is. All right. So really what we want to do is we want to be able to provide progress. Again, this is, progression in the game. How do I show that the game, that you're progressing? And it's, we want to be able to show data. How are players doing? Is their character evolving? Are their abilities improving? Is their experience going up? As an example, so that they can go to the next level. Did they get a new power or ability as they've moved through their progression? And where do I find that information? How do I use that ability? Just-in-time training is probably one of the best things to implement in your game, and your user interface has to support that. When I say just-in-time training is when you need to use that thing, that's when you introduce it, okay? And that's something that's been talked about in our play heuristics handout that I've given you. So again, here's some questions you can ask to make your interface more goal-oriented or centered. Do I give the player enough information to help them take actions that further their goals, quests, whether it's a main quest or a side quest? Do I expose the right mix of short, mid, and long-term goals, throughout the gameplay, the time that they're playing the game? And what is the most important reason my players are here? And can I provide them with a clear way to advance toward the goal throughout my interface? All right, so the interface, again, connects to the goals, connects to the narrative, connects to, to the gameplay. Intuitions, the I in Magic. An intuitive interface is one where you can kind of understand how to use it without reading a manual, okay? And this, again, ties into play heuristics and Nielsen's heuristics, recognition rather than recall. I want to be able to recognize what that thing is, as an example, compared to, trying to figure out what it is. I don't know what that symbol means. I got to look it up. I got to, click on the interface to figure out what that is. You shouldn't have to do that, right? As an example. So that's kind of really important to be able to do. Intuitiveness is something that you should be able to look at. You should be able to kind of take stuff from the real world affordances, and bring them into the interface. So again, I want to be able to bring stuff that I know from the real world into the game world. Okay, actually, that's another Nielsen heuristic. If you look up the that little website that I gave you. Some of it is going to be new to your player, some part of the interface, because you're kind of introducing, most likely, some kind of new mechanic that differentiates your game from other games that are out there. But that learning process has to be so transparent and so intuitive, the way you're introducing it, how you're turning on aspects of your interface, even if it's new, and you're training the player on how to use that thing just when they need it. So it's not cold storage. It's not something that they're going to look at and forget, right? They want to be able to use it, and they want to understand what it does. If it's a cooldown that's happening in your interface, explain that this is what's happening. It's a cooldown. So things like tooltips and help text in a non-mobile game work well. Doing that with your finger doesn't always work so good, but pressing on different icons or whatever on a mobile device can help you get information about how things should work. And labels are really important as well. So things to ask yourself when it comes to making your interface intuitive is, did I get carried away with things, making things cool rather than intuitive? Because I want to make things aesthetic, but sometimes the aesthetic part can take away from, hey, what is this thing that I'm trying to use? Can I find objects in the real world familiar to players, affordances that I can bring into the game world through the interface? And what metaphors can I leverage with icons and symbols and other things that can give the players an idea of what to do without being trained to do it? Okay. And I'm not going to go too much into control. I think we've gone into what agency is. This semester's all been about agency for me. That's what the most important thing about playing a desktop role-playing game is, tabletop role-playing game, which is I want to have control. My fellow players have told me that I'm crazy when I play Dungeons and Dragons because it's like I'm able to act out, as an example, when I'm playing the game, right? I need that control, right? And it's true. I feel constricted a lot of times when I'm playing a digital game, whereas when I'm in person, when I'm playing even a remote, when I'm playing on Roll20 or something else, when I have a live person at the other end, I have a sense of agency. And if we can capture that, I think that is an amazing thing to be able to capture in our game. The more agency the player feels that they have and that they perceive that they have, and if the interface supports that, that's something that's going to make our game kind of enduring and also interesting to play. We want to be able to reward, the player, to let them know that things are working, and we want to give them immediate feedback and reward players when they're doing something the right way. This also ties into things like, hey, let's give players the sense that maybe they're doing something wrong. Error correction. I want to be able to, provide some direction when it comes to error correction for the player. Hey, they're going down the wrong path, right? Use colors, use symbols, use things in your game that can help them, go in the right direction. When it comes to control, do I provide a reaction for every action? Okay, so when I, press on a control, do I get a sound back? When I go into the game world, can I hear myself, work, my player traveling through the game world, right? Have I used things like light and sound and layout efficiently, in my game world to make it interesting for me? Do I make it safe for the players to probe the interface and see what actions are possible? Right? I want to be able to kind of go through the interface and do that. Some games don't allow that to happen. If you try and do that in the middle of a game, you'll get killed in some games, right? And that's, kind of something that might be violated. You might be violating this heuristic if that's an important thing. And are there places I could cut down the number of steps required to perform important actions? Is there ways of me offering shortcuts to advanced players, right? And actually, this is another thing that is covered in the Nielsen heuristics: a shortcut, flexibility in game style. All right, in order for my advanced players to be able to play quicker, to be able to skip steps, in order for them to be able to, to complete an action better. Someone's burning something again in my house. Last part that I want to end off with is other considerations to think about that wrap up this talk when it comes to interface design. And one of them is, colors and symbols in the service of readability. Okay, so here's the game, StarCraft Remastered 2017, with the clear color difference between fighting factions. Take a look at this, right? You've got colors. Remember, we talked about this in the interface, for the enemy and your players. What does that look like? All right, that's really important. Less is more. Days Gone 2019. The button for refuel and fuel level displayed above the motorcycle. Take a look at that, right? It's right there inside of the motorcycle itself. It's not exactly diegetic, but it's giving us an interface, a way of connecting with, our game world, which is intuitive. Okay, so something that's really, really good. Collecting feedback from users. A simple star rating feedback in Assassin's Creed Black Flag. Not that that was my favorite game in any way, but the feedback is really important. It kind of gives feedback to the to the game designers to say this was good, or I didn't like this so much. And you can add all kinds of feedback. This is a very simple rating system, a star rating system, but you can actually write to the designers here as well. Kind of a neat way of doing stuff. Adding functions which users want. Resident Evil 2 2019, a remake which fans wanted to see. So put out something that users want. And sometimes it's multiple things that make a game great that people want to see again. And giving users control. Here's an example of a heavily modded World of Warcraft UI, right? The ability for you to add any kind of user interface you want to in order for you to be the most effective player you can be in your mind. All right, so that is my talk on user interface design and on game fundamentals when it comes to creating user interfaces and why they're important using the magic system. So one of the things that I've asked you guys to do, just to reiterate for your in-class exercises, take a look at games with user interfaces that speak to you. And it doesn't have to be a mobile game. It'd be nice, because that's what we're talking about here in this course, social and multiplayer game design, as well as specifically focus on mobile games, because mobile games are social, right? But it could be other games. Think about what those games are where the user interface really worked well. And what are those things? If you're going to rate your based on 3 criteria of your own, 3 to 5, let's say, what are those things? First, look at them from a Nielsen's criteria perspective, and then go back and make your own. Maybe there's some things that aren't covered in the standard usability tests. All right, questions around or comments around user interfaces for mobile, and some of the important things that I've talked about here today in our lecture, and anything else that you've heard from Mark as a playtester today in his talk. All right, I'm going to stop recording this one now, and I'm going to go into the last part of why we're here today, which is to fix some of the problems that some people may have had. It's going to be a very brief video because I want to talk about some fixes that the TA and I came up with for your mobile deployment to LD Player. So I'm going to talk about that in the next video. Let's stop recording now, and we'll come back and talk about that.